In August of 1943, a German soldier stood at the rail of a transport ship as it came alongside a dock in Norfolk, Virginia, and he could not make the picture in front of him agree with everything he had been told. He had been told that America was bluffing. He had been told that the tank numbers were propaganda, that the ship numbers were a lie, that the factories printed in the leaflets did not really run the way the leaflet said. He had carried that belief across an ocean. And now he was looking at a working American port in the middle of an ordinary morning, and the belief was coming apart in his hands. The cranes were moving. The freight was stacking up faster than he had ever seen freight move anywhere. And some of the people running those cranes, high up in the cabs over the water, were women. One of the men on those ships left us a record of exactly how it felt. His name was Reinhold Pabel. He had already fought 2 tours on the Russian front, been wounded, and gone back into the war as a sergeant in the Desert Army. He was not a soft man. And he was not a man who frightened easily. And the first thing America did to him was not frighten him. It confused him. They marched the prisoners off the ship and put them through a delousing line. The ordinary processing any army gives men coming out of months in the field. Then they walked to the railroad station, and waiting there were passenger coaches with modern upholstered seats, the kind of cars you would put ordinary travelers in, not the kind you would expect for a column of captured enemy soldiers. The men were surprised before the train even moved. Then a porter came down the aisle carrying coffee and sandwiches, and he offered them around politely, the way you would offer food to guests. Pabel wrote that in that moment, most of the men felt the anti-American feeling they had been carrying for years start to drain out of them. They had been told they were crossing into the country of a weak and frightened enemy. The enemy handed them a sandwich and a hot cup of coffee and treated them like human beings before the train had even left the platform. He had surrendered 3 months earlier in Tunisia, one of nearly 250,000 men who laid down their arms when the German army in Africa collapsed. He thought the worst was behind him. He thought he understood the war. Standing on that dock and sitting in that rail car, he realized he understood almost nothing about the country that had just shipped him across the Atlantic. This is the story of how the German army stopped believing its own propaganda. Not in a briefing room. Not from a captured document. On a dock. In a rail car. In a prison camp in Mississippi. Watching America with their own eyes. To understand why that dock hit them so hard, you have to go back to what they had been told, and who told them. For years, the men at the top of the German command had a simple answer for anyone who worried about the United States. The Americans, they said, could not really fight a modern war. They could make cars. They could make iceboxes. They could make the small comforts of a soft country. But weapons of war at the scale that mattered? Not a chance. Hermann Göring put it most famously. He reportedly sneered that the Americans could not build aircraft, that they were very good at refrigerators and razor blades, and not much else. It was the kind of line that got repeated because it was easy to repeat. It flattered the people saying it. It turned the largest economy on Earth into a nation of appliance salesmen. And it was not just Göring. The view ran all the way to the top. Intelligence came in about American factory capacity, about what the United States could build if it ever fully turned its industry toward the war, and that intelligence was waved off. One of the men closest to it all, Nikolaus von Below, who served as the Luftwaffe adjutant at headquarters, later described the attitude toward American industry as a kind of amateur cluelessness, a refusal to do the homework, a decision to believe the comfortable thing instead of the true thing. So that was the official line the ordinary German soldier carried into battle. America is loud. America is rich. But America is soft. And America is bluffing. Here is the problem with believing your own slogans. The numbers were already against them, and the numbers were not secret. Go back to 1938, before a single shot of this war was fired. In that year, the national income of the United States was already close to double that of Germany, Japan, and Italy combined. Not double one of them, double all 3 of them, added together. American steel output was higher than Germany's. American coal output was higher than Germany's. The raw foundation of war-making power was already sitting in the United States, in plain daylight, years before anyone needed it. The German command looked at that and decided it did not matter. They decided the Americans would never organize it, never focus it, never turn all that capacity into actual tanks and actual ships and actual planes pointed at them. That was the bet. And we are about to watch that bet come due, one prisoner at a time. Let me take you back to the moment the men in this story were captured, because the scale of it was the first crack. In the middle of May, 1943, the German and Italian armies in North Africa surrendered. The campaign that had once carried German tanks deep across the desert ended on a peninsula in Tunisia, cut off, out of fuel, out of room to run. When the surrender was complete, the number of prisoners taken was staggering. Depending on how you count, somewhere between 238,000 and 275,000 German and Italian troops went into captivity in a matter of days. It was one of the largest mass surrenders of the entire war. Soldiers who had thought of themselves as an elite desert army, the Afrika Korps, suddenly found themselves in long columns, disarmed, waiting to be processed and shipped somewhere they could not yet imagine. Men like Pavel, who had survived the Russian winter and the desert heat, were now just numbers in a line, waiting for a boat. At the very top of that surrender was a single man, Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, the commander of the entire army group in Africa. He had taken over command earlier that spring, after Rommel left the theater, and on the 12th of May, it was von Arnim who carried the weight of the surrender as the senior officer. He was the highest-ranking German in Africa, and now he was a prisoner. What happened to von Arnim next tells you something about how the war was about to re-educate the men who lost it. Von Arnim was not thrown into a barbed wire pen and forgotten. He was a senior general, and senior generals were valuable. So he was moved first to Britain, to a set of country houses outside London that looked, on the surface, like a comfortable retirement for a defeated commander. Latimer House, Trent Park, quiet estates, good food, long walks in the garden. What the generals did not know was that the walls were listening. But hold that thought, because we will come back to those bugged houses, and to what von Arnim and the other generals said when they thought no one could hear them. First, follow the ordinary prisoners, the ones with no car and no driver, as they were loaded onto ships and sent across the Atlantic. Because the re-education of the German army did not start in a fancy estate. It started on the water, and it landed on a dock. The ships carried them west across the ocean toward the United States. And one of the doors into America, for thousands of these men, was the Port of Norfolk, Virginia. Pavel was one of them, and he kept a record the whole way. From his surrender in May, across the sea, to his arrival months later, at a camp deep in the American South. His diary, and others like it, give us something better than any official report. They give us the exact moment the propaganda died, written down by the men it was supposed to protect. The first thing that hit them was the harbor itself. They had been told America was strained, stretched thin, hurting. What they saw was a port, running at full speed on a normal day. Cargo coming off ships and onto trains in volume that did not match anything they had been told. One memoir describes a single morning at Norfolk, moving more freight than a German port handled in a week. The prisoners stood and watched it happen, and could not square it with the country they had been promised was bluffing. And then there were the cranes. Up in the crane cabs, working the heavy machinery over the water, were women. This was a real wartime sight in America. With so many men in uniform, women had moved into the docks, and the shipyards, and the factory floors, welding, operating cranes, running production lines. To the German prisoners, it was almost impossible to process. They had been told America could not even fully man its war effort. And here was a country so deep in workers that it had opened entire new ranks of labor, and was still running its ports at a speed they had never witnessed. That was the dock. The country had not even begun to make its real argument yet. If the harbor cracked the belief, the train ride inland shattered it. The prisoners were loaded onto those upholstered coaches and moved across the eastern United States toward their camps. The route carried them through Virginia and Kentucky, mile after mile of a country none of them had ever seen, and the diaries record them doing something almost childlike. Pavel wrote that the men pressed their noses against the window panes. They could not look away. The first thing many of them counted was the automobiles. Pavel wrote that the very first impression, the thing that hit before anything else, was the abundance of cars. Cars everywhere. Cars parked outside ordinary houses, 2 and 3 to a home in towns that were not rich, not special, just normal American towns. They had been told America was a country pushed to the edge by the war. What rolled past the window was a country with so much that ordinary families still kept cars they were barely using. Think about what that does to a man who has spent 2 years being told a story. He is not reading a number on a page that he can argue with. He is counting cars with his own eyes, one after another, until the counting becomes pointless because there are simply too many. And the towns themselves were the deepest cut of all. The prisoners had been told a story about America under attack, a story in which the cities of the American coast had been bombed, burned, broken. They expected blackouts. They expected rubble. They expected a country bleeding the way Europe was bleeding. Instead, the train rolled past town after town that was whole. Lights on. Factory windows glowing through the evening. Shops open. People going about ordinary business as if there were no war within 1,000 miles, because there was not. The bombing they had been promised had never touched this place. The ruin they had been told about did not exist. Not in one town. Not in the next one. Not anywhere the rails carried them. For many of these men, this was the moment the war ended in their heads, long before it ended on any map. Multiple memoirs say it plainly. Riding that train, looking out that window at an untouched, humming, overstocked country, they understood for the first time that the war was already lost. Not losing. Lost. Decided. The argument was over, and they had been on the wrong side of the numbers the entire time. And here is the detail that makes it land. Nobody had to convince them. No interrogator sat them down. No officer gave a speech. The country just rolled past the glass and told them the truth all by itself. Now let me show you the receipts behind that train window, because the abundance they were staring at was not an accident. It was the bet the German command had laughed off, coming due all at once. Start with tanks. The Americans built 49,324 Sherman tanks alone. One single type of tank. More than 49,000 of them. And the Sherman was only part of it. Across all types, the United States built somewhere around 86 to 88,000 tanks in total. The German command had decided the Americans would never turn their factories into armor. The Americans turned out tanks by the tens of thousands. Then the aircraft. Remember the line about refrigerators and razor blades? The sneer that Americans could not build planes. Early in the war, the American president set a goal of 50,000 aircraft a year, and the German leadership treated it as a fantasy, a number invented for newspapers. By the end of the war, the United States had built roughly 300,000 military aircraft. 300,000. The fantasy number was not even close to the real one. Then the trucks. 2.4 million military trucks. This is the part people forget, because trucks are not glamorous. But trucks are how an army actually moves and eats and fights. America did not just outbuild the enemy in weapons. It outbuilt them in the boring, endless supply of everything an army needs to keep going. And then the ships. This is where the scale stops sounding like an army and starts sounding like a force of nature. The United States built 2,710 Liberty ships, the workhorse cargo vessels that carried the whole war across the oceans. At the start, a ship like that took more than 200 days to build. By the time American shipyards hit their stride, the average had fallen to around 42 days. 42 days, start to finish, for an ocean-going ship. And then, to prove a point, they went further. In 1942, at a shipyard in Richmond, California, workers laid the keel of a Liberty ship named the Robert E. Peary and did not stop. They had prefabricated every section they could and lined the pieces up in advance, and then they assembled the whole thing in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. It was the 47th ship that Yard had built, and it was a deliberate dare. 250,000 parts, weighing about 14 million pounds, fitted together into a finished ship in under 5 days. It was partly a stunt, a competition between shipyards. But the message inside the stunt was aimed straight at the people who said America was bluffing. The whole point of building a ship that fast, and putting it in the newspapers, was to say one thing out loud. America could build ships faster than the enemy could ever hope to sink them. That was not a slogan. That was a clock the German Navy could not beat, and the Americans were showing it off. This was the country rolling past the train window, not a soft nation of appliance makers. The largest war machine the world had ever seen, and it had been visible in the numbers since before the first shot. Now let me take you back to those quiet English country houses, because while the ordinary prisoners were learning the truth through a train window, the generals were admitting it to each other in secret. Trent Park looked like a gentleman's estate. The captured German generals housed there were given comfort, conversation, room to walk the grounds. They believed they were simply being held in style befitting their rank. What they did not know was that British intelligence, working through a unit called MI-19, had wired the place from top to bottom. Microphones in the walls, microphones in the light fixtures, hidden recording equipment capturing nearly every private word. The generals talked. They talk the way men talk, when they are certain no enemy can hear them. And decades later, the historian Sönke Neitzel went through those transcripts and published them, and they are one of the most honest records we have of what the German High Command actually believed, as opposed to what it said in public. The split among the generals was sharp. Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma had already turned hard against the leadership in Berlin. He spoke openly, in those rooms, about the war being unwinnable, about the men in charge having led the country off a cliff. Ludwig Krewell sat in the same house and pushed back, still defending the cause, still loyal. The two of them argued for months, two captured generals fighting the war over again inside a bugged English manor, with the microphones catching every word neither of them knew was being saved. But underneath the arguments, on the question of material strength, the honesty leaked through. In private, these men acknowledged the thing they had waved away in public. The Allies had a depth of material, a flood of equipment, a manufacturing weight that German production simply could not match. The same superiority they had publicly dismissed as enemy propaganda, they privately conceded was real and was crushing. That is the quiet center of this whole story. The dismissal was always for show. Even the men who sneered at American industry had a part of themselves that knew, and when they thought the world could not hear them, that part of themselves did the talking. Von Arnim himself eventually crossed the same ocean as his soldiers and ended up in the same country, though in very different conditions. He was interned at Camp Clinton, in Mississippi, the camp the Americans set aside for their most senior German prisoners. Around 25 German generals were held there, the highest concentration of captured German brass anywhere in the United States, and von Arnim, as the senior man among them, was treated accordingly. He was given a house, he was given a car, and a driver. People in the area later remembered that he even went to the movies in nearby Jackson, partly because the theater was one of the only air-conditioned rooms in town. And here is the part that makes the whole bet visible in one place. The German prisoners at that camp were put to work, and the work they did was build a 1 square mile working model of the entire Mississippi River and its tributaries, a scale replica the United States Army used to plan flood control. Sit with that. The same country the German command had called a nation of refrigerator salesmen was so rich in land and labor and ambition that it had its captured enemy soldiers building a miniature of a river system bigger than anything in Europe just to manage its own water better. Sit with the strangeness of all of it. The way it must have sat with von Arnim, the senior German commander from the entire African campaign, the man who carried the surrender of 250,000 troops, spending the rest of the war in the American South. Driven to an air-conditioned movie theater, living quietly in a country his side had insisted could only make iceboxes and razor blades, in a region untouched by the war, surrounded by the casual abundance his army had refused to believe in. He was released and sent home in the summer of 1947. He had seen, up close and for years, the thing the German command had bet would never exist. So what do you do with all of this? 240,000 men captured in a desert, a dock full of moving cranes, a porter handing out coffee like the enemy were guests, a train window full of whole, lit, untouched towns, a bugged country house full of generals quietly admitting the truth, a camp in Mississippi where captured soldiers built a model of a river while their commander went to the movies. What ties it together is one simple, brutal fact. The German command did not lose this part of the war because they lacked information. They lost it because they refused to believe the information they already had. The American numbers were not hidden. The national income was public. The steel output was public. The factories were photographed and printed. All of it sat in the open for years. They called it a lie because the truth was inconvenient, because it was more comfortable to imagine an enemy of refrigerator salesmen than an enemy that could build a finished ship in under 5 days and 49,000 of a single tank. And the men who paid for that comfort were the ordinary soldiers, the payables. The ones who carried the slogan into the desert, survived Russia and the heat of Tunisia, surrendered, crossed an ocean, and finally learned the truth the hard way, with their noses pressed to a railcar window, watching a country roll by that should not have been possible if everything they had been told was true. There was no document that broke them, no interrogation, no speech. Just America, going about an ordinary day, with the lights on, and the cranes moving, and the cars parked 3 to a house, quietly proving that the numbers had been real the whole time, and that the men at the top had simply chosen not to look. That was the moment the bluff they had been promised turned out to be the only thing in the entire war that had actually been a bluff. And it was there.